course, those in the room who are not cluster coordinators but are interested, please approach us afterwards. Now, I'm conscious, again, we're a little bit up against the wire. We have 15 minutes for questions. Online, I understand the video link has gone down, so anybody who is still patiently and stoically continuing to listen through audio, I mean, please send in your questions. We've got time, perhaps if we take initial 3 questions from the room. Just be aware, although we close at 5, for those who are actually fortunate enough to be here in ODI in London, there will be a reception afterwards in the lounge, so if you find your questions not been answered, and you have time to stick around, we all retire to the lounge. So firstly in the room, do we have any questions for the authors and or our panellists? So perhaps if I take, and then Victoria, and then John? Please. We'll take the 3 questions and then we'll go back to the...
Good afternoon, I'm Jean-Michel from Action Against Hunger. I found your remark and the lack of information on the subnational approach quite interesting and worrying in a way that, first of all, we speak a lot about the cost, and here the cluster is very sector approach, which, when it's duplicated locally, will cost a fortune and is unsustainable. So is there another model where indeed you don't need to have experts, you need to have managers, when you have to have people who can embrace the different sectors and do not have these very experts, and you have to multiply the experts in order to be effective and spread on a map. The second one is about this link with the national entity. Our perspective, or my perspective, is to say that we speak a lot about national NGOs, how we engage. National NGOs, for me, has as much value as national staff of an international NGO. What counts is this local level. That's the local CBOs, the local NGOs who are grassrooted, who have the knowledge. And I think that how we capture that, knowing that they don't have the means. Here again, we have a structure which is time-consuming, resource-consuming, and this organization, they have not. So how we capture that is by the subnational. And I think I expect in the future that we will be able to dig a bit further, and hopefully the World Humanitarian Summit is going to look a bit at this aspect rather than just endorsing the current one only. Thanks.
Thank you. 2 good questions. So what other model do we have for subnational? And secondly, how do we keep it local? Can we pass the mic over to Victoria and then John?
Good afternoon, Victoria Stoddart with IFRC. I've been the shelter cluster coordinator in the Philippines last year, and I've just got back from Nepal as the shelter cluster coordinator. 2 things really, I think possibly sort of reflective of Nepal, having literally just got back. Private sector and self-recovery. When we talk about coordination, really looking at overlaps and gaps, how I think one of our main struggles, and I'll just talk about it from the shelter cluster point of view, is really how do you ensure that your information that you're providing back to partners is accurate when you have no concept of what's going on with the private sector, especially at the subnational level, and self-recovery. It's very difficult to gather that. So immediately, and we're seeing it in Nepal straight away, a month in, our data is already questionable because we're dealing with subnational governments that don't understand the process of reporting and the needs for it. Also, I think that also goes to needing to do more assessments, as you've mentioned. Instead of data collection, perhaps ground truthing is more important. But also just coming back to the raising awareness point around actors, I think as a coordinator, obviously you're stretched in very many different ways, and it's really how to get that raising awareness amongst the private sector, amongst donors as well, amongst lead agencies of truly what the cluster is. And certainly in Nepal we saw that around the HCT. I think I think there was a big lack of direction from the HCT, and really, as the cluster coordination platform, the intercluster platform, we really had to demand a strategy from the HCT instead of truck and chuck. And I think, sorry, it's a bit blunt and perhaps a bit tired, but I do just think it's private sector, when you talk about cash, how this all fits in amongst the private sector and in country.
Thank you, Victoria. So, private sector issue of self-recovery HCT strategy, and I would actually perhaps put that under a little bit of the heading of, all the activities that happen outside the clusters. The private sector go off and do things, self-recovery people are doing it. What is the role of interagency, and what does that mean for coordination in general? How do you coordinate the bits who are not interested in being coordinated? John.
Thank you, John Mitchell from ALNAP. I have one basic question, really. It's a very basic question about what makes coordination work. And this was the very question that I remember about 20 years ago, a group of researchers from the humanitarian policy group here were looking at. And I remember when I worked for the Red Cross, I remember being interviewed for this study. And the two things that I remember from this study, one of them was that agencies didn't like being coordinated. And the second one was the solution that the researchers gave to this problem was to set up a super consolidated UN agency that had legitimate power to knock people's heads together to make them coordinate properly. But if I understood what Paul was saying, that what's actually happening is that agencies are making rational decisions based upon weighing up the pros and cons of coordinating in this line between communication and alignment, weighing it up and making rational decisions. And so I suppose my question would be, do you think that the recommendation that the researchers came up 15 years ago has been shown to be absolutely wrong and muddle-headed, misguided?
Thank you, John. Well, perhaps if we just spread the questions along a little bit. So to begin with, around the issue of was first raised around subnational and engaging local, empowering locals, putting coordination in the hands of locals. Who would like to respond to that? I mean, Gerbrand, you obviously raised as an issue. Do you have an alternative solution? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but with your magic wand.
With my magic wand. I don't know what the... I wouldn't see what an alternative could be, to be honest. But what I do think is that this is also based on other experience in other countries, but a more of an... Yeah, I don't want to talk in general terms, but often I think what sometimes happens is that NGOs, they come in and they say, well, this is the project that I'm going to do, based on needs. And rather than trying to fit it in with a government process or a development plan. What I've seen in Uganda, where I worked there, is our NGO did things, government was happy with it, but after the NGO left, it fell flat. And I think NGOs, we sometimes want to do things quickly because of, several reasons. Public, of course, says, well, there's earthquake, you should help. There is a donors, you have limited time to implement, so you don't have the time to get into that conversation, which I think should happen more. But that is not the first time it has been said, I think. But yeah, as to an alternative, I wouldn't see that kind of coordination mechanism.
Okay, thank you. Now, again, I'm watching the clock, and it seems that the rest of the panel all want to comment on this. So if I can ask you to comment on this question around, localising coordination, but keep it really short and succinct. So perhaps, Laurie.
Well, maybe go to the comment about the private sector, because I do think there's a lot more emphasis and interest right now in the private sector and the role the private sector can play, not as companies that donate money, but as actors that are delivering services on the ground. And that is perhaps one of the reasons why we could envisage the cluster transforming more perhaps into a network type of system. Now, to some degree, that already happens, but that's providing normative guidance, but that's also making sure that the various groups of actors are connected to each other somehow. It could be through information exchanges or sharing, maybe not even getting to the point of alignment. Maybe it's simply communication. It's not just the private sector, it's community groups, it's church groups as well. There are, especially in a sudden onset emergency, local communities, local individuals that react quite quickly in an emergency, that when the cluster is activated, perhaps we are overwhelming those local capacities. They are no longer part of the system, and therefore we're reducing their own coping strategy and their long-term resilience. So I think there is an understanding that we need to not think of the cluster as something that we invite people to join and become a member of, but rather the cluster transforms itself and reaches out to the other actors that are operating and makes sure that they're all linked up together in a form of network. That's how I would see it.
Thank you, Laurie. Leah.
I just have two brief comments, and I just wanted to say that they're all such great comments that have been made and questions, and touching on things that we didn't even get to in the paper, which says a lot considering the paper is over 120 pages long. So it does show you the real kind of the deepness of this issue and how varied our discussions could be. So just briefly, I could have misunderstood, but forgive me, but I made a note about your point about a national NGO and national staff, and I challenge that they're the same thing, because I think it touches on the link that Loretta mentioned earlier in terms of that long-term process, and a national NGO is an entity that will be there. And so that's just something that I wanted to pick up on. And then going back to what Victoria said in terms of how to tell others what the cluster is, in the report we list a kind of to-do list that the clusters currently have. And one of our recommendations at the end of the report is that the clusters first need to decide what they are and what they are going to do. And I think, so I'd respond to that by saying, clusters need to figure out who they are and what they're doing, and then that's what they can tell people, because you can't really say, this is what we're doing, this is how you can get involved, until you actually know what you're actually going to realistically achieve in that kind of body.
Thank you, Leah. One quick comment before I hand to Paul for the tricky question around from John, around the issue of localising and nationalising the response. Of course, I sit here, representing the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. We live and breathe both the benefits that brings, but also the challenges. And you only have to talk to anyone within the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement about coordination within the movement. 189 sovereign national societies, sovereign, can't be told what to do, Federation, and then the International Committee of the Red Cross. I mean, it's a challenge. Paul, would you like to deal, well, obviously any of the particular questions, but particularly closing on John's comment around...
Well, actually, I'm slightly putting two of them together about the local piece, and because it is a, this is only about a bit of a bigger thing, and, had we but worlds enough and time, we would have looked at not only the clusters, but the ICCM and the HCTs as a larger piece. That proved logistically challenging. But it does come back to, it does, going to John's question about this, I don't know what people in this room think about having a single super UN response organisation. I would imagine the ideas around that would be perhaps mixed at best. This does come up a lot. Wouldn't everything be easier? And I think it's a discussion which is not only about coordination. It's also a discussion that we've seen about standards. It's a generic discussion which is always going to happen, where you've got lots and lots of different organisations trying to do very similar things in the same place. And so it's not just about, it's a bigger humanitarian conversation about how do we deal with all these different organisations. And generally one of two things is proposed. Let's not have lots of organisations. Let's put them all together and have one. Or let's not have lots of standards. Let's put them all together and have one. Let's unify. Or let's try and optimize the fact of diversity. So those are kind of two basic choices that occur here, I think, in the conversation certainly that we've been part of. And the problem with the first one, I think there are two main problems with the super singular response. Three main problems. Firstly, in terms, it's probably not realistic, because a lot of, even if it was politically possible, a lot of the agencies, and I'm not talking now about the NGOs, but particularly about the Red Cross family and UNHCR, and so they have international legal mandates. You know, they're not just amenable to, oh, tomorrow we're not going to have a UNHCR. It's more complex than that because of the architecture of you know where they come from. And the same is true of ICRC and the IFRC. So the question of whether it would even be possible, I think, is an important one to unify significantly the organisations which currently exist. And then you've got the question of whether it would be desirable, going back to the recommendation that was made. And I think we would reach for evidence of that, partly because it hasn't been tried, but also we'd reach for evidence of that being a better way of doing it. You know, where is the evidence that putting everything together would make it more successful, more effective, more efficient, than actually having lots of different interacting pieces? So what do we do about that? I think if one starts thinking, well, what would it look like if we were to accept diversity and difference, but make it much, much more effective than it currently is, but on the sort of basis, on the sort of footing that currently exists. Some of the clues, and you know, many of you will have heard us in ALNAP saying this before, but some of the clues would probably come out of those people who do a lot of this stuff already. People who do, for example, unified command systems. You have to get the police and the ambulance and the fire service to work together, and who have had, frankly, a lot more money to think about this stuff than we have. Part of it would come out of the fact that a lot of our colleagues on the ground are doing things very successfully, and we're much better at finding where things aren't working than we are at actually sort of trying to suck out the success. And I think that there is probably something that could be done around diversity. It would probably be about rethinking three things. Firstly, rethinking the relative role of the centre and the groups, you know, the HCT and the clusters and the ICCM. It's obviously not quite right now, and what the HCTs are expected to do is a very high level of detail for a high-level strategy-setting body to do. Yeah? One can imagine perhaps a situation where what the HCTs are doing is putting very broad ground rules, very broad simple rules, and key objectives forward, rather than coming up with these really quite thick documents, and leaving the interpretation of how those objectives are met within those broad rules to a more decentralized approach. So I think one thing would be rebalancing the not taking away the importance of the centre, but rethinking what they are actually meant to be producing, these different levels. I think another thing would be so the second piece I think I can imagine is moving away from the slightly obsessional thing that we all have with structures and looking at procedures more. Yeah? You don't have to unify structures to get everyone working in the same way. You know, as we've seen with Sphere, for example. You can have small local NGOs, IFRC, national societies, UN, working in broadly similar ways without actually having to move any of the organograms around. And it's potentially a much more effective way of coordinating than creating coordination structures. And it's actually, of course, something that the clusters have done very well. So the second thing is look at process, not at structure. And I think the third thing, which is really interesting, but I'm not sure how it would work, but it goes to your question about the local, is it's very interesting to see that instant command is modular, and it always starts at the crisis and builds up. Yeah? And we always start at the capital and build down, sort of, only we don't normally kind of quite get there. Yeah? And reimagining the basic thing that we have, but with a slightly different role for the centre, and where it's more setting the general ground rules, an emphasis more on procedures and less on structures, and a thinking about what does this look like if we build up from the emergency rather than building down from the capital, I imagine might solve some of these problems.
Thank you, Paul. Now, I'm sure there may well be other questions, but I'm conscious we're now 4 minutes over time. I want to respect your time and the fact that we're at the end of the day. Again, I reiterate there's a reception afterwards, so those who would like to stay on and continue the conversation amongst yourselves with us, if you have those burning questions, please do so. Otherwise, I would like to thank you, all those who are patiently online. If there is someone still online, thank you for that. For you in the room, thank you very much for coming. And I'd like to thank our panel. Please give them a round of applause. And the reception is the lounge next door, which is just that way. I think that's where we came in. Great, thank you. That's fabulous. No, thank you very much.
Really good, really good.
Well, I was going to say, actually, we could have talked on, as you say,
Sorry,
something
we-
you laid